Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. All right, let's transition really quick to another story. I don't think it's the most important story coming out of this weekend. I do think it's a huge story for what could potentially happen this coming weekend. Because in addition to Clemson, Notre Dame this coming weekend, the second big game is Georgia, Florida, the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. And so that's the big game. But something happened on Saturday that's putting Florida in major jeopardy. Something happened on Saturday that is putting Florida in major jeopardy for the Georgia game next week. And that's this. Don't know if you saw it, but there was a brawl on the field. There was a big fight, and I think it's fair to argue that at least in part, Dan Mullen, I don't want to say instigated it, but I think he helped escalate it. Maybe that's the best way to put it. I don't think he instigated it, but I do think he helped escalated. And so I think, as I'm recording here Sunday evening, things can change. Don't get me wrong. Things are always subject to change. But I could see a scenario where, depending on the circumstances, the SEC may not allow Dan Mullen to coach that game. And so let me get into it. Let me get into some of the details. And by the way, by the time you listen on Monday, we should get clarification on that. But as I record here Sunday night, it's important. It's an important topic to talk about. So the topic with Dan Mullen goes like this. Florida's playing Missouri. Missouri's on the road. Florida is coming back off this COVID, Florida's coming off this COVID situation where, if you remember, Dan Mullen wants the swamp full for the LSU game. Whoops. Florida has like 35 players test positive. Dan Mullen tests positive. They haven't played in 3 weeks. And so they come back. They are beating the crap out of Missouri. You know how I know this? Because I bet Missouri. Neither here nor there. It's okay. Please gamble responsibly. But I bet Missouri. They're getting their butts kicked. And we're about to get to halftime. And Florida's star quarterback, Kyle Trask, drops back in the pocket and gets hit hard. And it's a cheap shot. And I will defend Dan Mullen, and I will defend Florida for saying it was a late hit, it was a cheap shot, it was unnecessary. And as the two teams are running to the locker room at halftime, tensions are obviously high. And in the middle of running to the locker room, Dan Mullen kind of starts to make his way over to the Missouri side of the field. And as he goes over there, his assistant coaches and players are like, holy crap, this guy's pissed. We got to pull him back. And so as they go to pull him back, obviously the team comes closer, Missouri comes closer, and an all-out brawl happens. You've seen the videos by now. Guys swinging, guys punching. I still don't really get why guys would punch guys that are wearing helmets and pads, but you get the point. There was a lot of pushing and shoving. And this could have major implications on next week's Florida-Georgia game. First of all, 3 players were thrown out of the game. But you'd have to think, as the SEC continues to look at the tape, that more players on both sides will potentially have be suspended for the upcoming game. Ironically, by the way, how about this? Florida's playing Georgia this coming week. Missouri has a bye. Then they play Georgia. So if anything, Georgia might have been the big benefactor here, because Georgia might have suspended players for Florida this week and then Missouri next week from the same brawl. But I do think players from Florida will be suspended, and I think there's a real conversation to be had about should Dan Mullen be suspended. Now, in defense of a Florida fan listening, and we have some, I get a Florida fan's perspective. A coach should always defend his player. I get it. You want your coach to stand up for his guys, whether something dirty happens, something cheap happens, something physical happens, or if it's just something like the Big Ten canceling the season. It was cool to see Scott Frost go to bat for the Big Ten and for Nebraska. It was cool to see Jim Harbaugh, for all the crap he gets, go to bat for Michigan to play football. It was cool to see Ryan Day, Justin Fields, etc. We'll get to them in a minute. So I understand a Florida fan like, Of course our coach is going to defend our guy. But here's the issue. Dan Mullen, first of all, runs over, instigates this thing. Again, I'm not saying he started it, but it was kind of like throwing a match on gasoline, right? Dan Mullen, the whole situation was kind of gasoline, and Dan Mullen was the match that lit it up. And you know me, I'm not Mr. like suspend everybody, fire everybody, this is the worst thing ever. But what I would say is this, is that the SEC has very aggressively handed out fines and punishment all fall long for much less stuff. I didn't bother to look into every detail, but we know that a bunch of these schools have been fined and punished for kind of a loose mask policy. I still remember Jeremy Pruitt on the sidelines looking like Little Red Riding Hood with his little mask on. Jimbo Fisher. There's been issues with masks. And then, of course, last week, Lane Kiffin got fined $25,000 for retweeting a tweet that was critical of SEC referees. Keep in mind, Lane Kiffin didn't criticize SEC referees. And on top of that, the SEC actually agreed with Lane Kiffin, and he still got fined $25,000. And so when I look at this situation, I think it's hard to argue that even if you want to defend Dan Mullen, that his actions weren't worse than what Lane Kiffin was. And oh, by the way, after the brawl gets broken up, he runs into the tunnel and then runs back out of the tunnel and gets the crowd fired up and starts waving and yelling and screaming. And so, first of all, I love Dan Mullen, the heel. We need more bad guys in college basketball, and I think Dan Mullen's just like, dude, I made it. I'm at Florida. I'm making $4 million a year. I'm here 10 more years. I'm going to retire. I'm living my best life. So I don't think he even cares. I love it. I hope he goes full Draymond Green, full heel turn, whatever. But on top of that, I think the SEC has a really tough decision to make. And I don't know what they'll do. And off the top of my head, I don't know that there's a really good precedent for what happened. But I think the SEC has kind of a tough decision to make. Because you've basically set the tone that, like, wait a second now. We've fined guys for not wearing masks properly. We fined guys for criticizing the refs. This guy helped perpetuate a brawl. You got to punish him in some way. And so I think a big fine is certainly coming for Dan Mullen. And I think the SEC has to at least consider suspending him for one game, which would obviously be Florida this weekend, which would be a huge story. So obviously I'm recording here Sunday night. By the time you guys listen midday Monday, we will probably get some sort of resolution. But I do think it's worth looking at because I think it is a big story coming out of the weekend.